Hi, I'm David Hurford. I'm the editor-in-chief of Perspectives on Language and Literacy, which is a journal of the International Dyslexia Association. I'm here with Daniel J. Shipp, the 10th president of Pittsburg State University. My colleagues on the board of Perspectives thought it'd be a really great idea if I interviewed you. Not because you're a university president and not because you're a visionary leader, but because you struggled to learn how to read as a child and
Still do.
And you've been really open about that, which is pretty amazing. You were announced as the 10th president last spring, and you and your family came this summer. And it's probably fair to say that a lot of people are still trying to figure out who you are, right?
Sure.
And so, like a lot of universities, Pittsburg State University has the Pitt State magazine. Goes out to 65,000 friends and alumni of Pittsburg State University. And in the most recent issue, which is it's really nice, the most recent issue, there is an article in
There's a lot of photoshopping that had to go into that.
Yeah, and the title is Getting to Know Dan. And I want to read to you the first two sentences of the article. The 10th president of Pittsburg State University grew up dyslexic. Still is.
Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word reading and difficulties with spelling. Dyslexia is neurobiologically based and affects reading comprehension, vocabulary development, and background knowledge.
Well, that's a pretty brave and really fearless approach today to kind of, in such a public forum, to say who you are. At least that defines to some extent who you are. So the board really wanted me to interview you because they thought you were a very interesting person. And of course, you had a lot of obstacles that you had to manage your way through and navigate through to become successful in education and to do the things you've done, that now you're the 10th president of Pittsburg State University. So a few questions for you.
Yeah.
And these questions are from the board and from other people who have asked what they thought they would like to know. So the first question is, what was learning to read like for you?
You know, I think back to kind of those early books, right, that you read when you were young. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and so a lot of time spent with Dr. Seuss, right? Mm-hmm. And as I remember my early school days, I remember how difficult it was. I remember, feeling like I was always a kid that was last to turn in assignments, and a lot of red ink on my reading comprehension in those early days, certainly. And
how'd that red ink make you feel?
Oh, I felt terrible, right? I always felt like I was letting my parents down. And the honest truth is, you felt like the dumb kid in the class. And that was tough, right? But yet, great parents, we tried hard, we read at home. I think my parents probably felt, back in the day, certainly, that what are we doing wrong? Like, what's wrong with him? Yeah. And you know this well, because you're a bit of a rock star in this field, David, but they, it's kind of that self-loathing then, like it's us, it's an us thing. It's, we're raising a son that doesn't get it and doesn't try hard enough, or, all those things, right? But I remember that time as just feeling like I'm disappointing my parents, right?
Yeah, and a lot of parents still today are told you just didn't read enough to your kid.
Oh my gosh. Right, and believe me, they read a lot to me, and certainly those were, because that's the one thing I remember too, is that you go from school where it was a struggle, then you go home, and then it's even more of a struggle. So you feel like you're underachieving at school, and then you feel like you're failing or disappointing your family at home.
Dyslexia is neurobiologically based. It is a myth that dyslexia is caused by not reading enough to children.
And that's pretty typical. The kids that we see at our center feel the same way.
Like, what's wrong with me?
Right.
Yeah.
And so when did you figure out that you had dyslexia? How did that work out? When did you discover that?
Well, we grew up in a small town in Nebraska, so, and you think about kind of early on in the 70s and 80s of families trying to figure out what is this and what's not working. We had a really helpful family doctor, I guess, that was, my parents were asking him, is there something physically wrong? Is there something wrong with his brain? Well, I mean, all yes, true, right? But they were more worried about longer term, like health implications, like maybe there's something that they don't know about, right? So it's the unknown that's scary for everybody. For me, certainly as a little person, and your family, right, wanting the best for you. And so anyway, the recommendation is to work with our local teachers, and there were several of them that were clued in to dyslexia, and we went through kind of a series of early reading tests, and that was their assessment, that I'm that far behind because my brain just wasn't seeing things. They were seeing things in a different way, and it's something that you can work through and build strategy. But that was going to take some different approaches and a little bit of different work. So, the center, I remember a Mrs. Bartunik, remember Pink Lemonade on her porch. She was a teacher in our community, and a Mrs. Rasmussen, that both worked with me after school and in the summers to really work on strategies to become a more effective reader. And that's where I started. In fact, I remember Mrs. Rasmussen saying, think of this as your superpower, right? You see things differently, and that's a good thing. So that kind of took my cortisol levels way down as a little person. It's like, wait a minute, like I can be a superhero. So this is actually, it could be pretty cool, and I could have a different way of seeing things that other people can't. So that always stuck with me. I was like, okay, that makes sense to me. So now it's okay to think different.
So it was kind of a relief then to find that out.
Oh, absolutely. And I think my parents too, like began to feel like, all right, there's some strategies to this that could be helpful to Dan, and certainly to me, it started to, the strategies that we employed began to really make a big difference to me, and certainly the results in school.
So would you say that's kind of a turning point in your life when things started to kind of make a little more sense, and then you felt better about yourself, and then your parents weren't worried about, like, after we die, what's going to happen to Dan?
Yeah. For them, for sure. Actually, at that time, I'm close, right? As we get older, we kind of forget the months and the years of things, but it was around that third grade, fourth grade time period where I started to really enjoy reading. Really enjoyed it because, in a way, I like to play puzzles, challenges. Maybe that's why I'm a university president. It's a giant puzzle to put together, but it allowed me to utilize those strategies reading did in ways to better understand what all those words meant on the page. So in a way, reading became, with those strategies, a chance to play a puzzle. So reading felt more like a game to be played. And even to this day, if you watched how I read, you will see a lot of circles and underlines and even numbers that I'm identifying as I read through it. It's not as much a study skill, it's a sequential approach to understanding the concepts that I read and connecting the dots as I move through a page. And that comes back from all those years ago, and it still kind of gives me that high of, I'm figuring this out, right?
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
I like that. I think more people are becoming aware of what dyslexia is and what to do about it. There are grassroots efforts, parents who have formed groups like Decoding Dyslexia and other groups that try to bring awareness to dyslexia. But What would you like people to know about dyslexia that maybe they don't?
That it's a way to, as your brain processes information, right? It's okay that we have brains that process information differently. And I go back to all those years, as I mentioned, it becomes, kind of flip it on its head, it becomes a superpower for a lot of folks. I mean, have a conversation with 10 people and ask anyone if they know somebody that's dyslexic. And many times in that room with 10 individuals, there'll be 2 or 3 of them that'll raise their hand, say, I was, and this is how I learned to utilize my superpower to become proficient at X, Y, or Z. So I think that it's far more common than people understand. I think the immediate, when you maybe are diagnosed as dyslexic, it becomes, oh my gosh, like I'm one of a million people that have this. Well, no, it's a lot more than that. And you know the numbers on this. I think that we're getting better at identifying. It's kind of liberating to those families and the students to just relax.
It is estimated that nearly 50 million people in the United States have dyslexia.
This is something that we can work through, and let's use the science of how to read better, differently, to improve reading, not only for young people or anyone who's diagnosed with dyslexia. It's good for everyone, right? So we learn to read differently, and I think that's something that if you're a family member or a person that's struggling with reading, that there's a lot of hope in that it's pretty common. It's nothing that should raise your cortisol levels. You should feel good that we have folks like you and probably the individuals we're talking to here that are really working to make this more digestible for the general public.
And it sounds like your family was a huge support for you.
Absolutely.
Because using the term superpower, you've worked through adversity, and as a function of working through that adversity, it kind of changes who you are. Mm-hmm. In your case, a positive way. I mean, you're a positive person who wants to see, you want to see other people be successful, and you're working to make that happen. But there are some kids who have dyslexia that are crushed. They don't have that family support, and they leave school, and their opportunities are not good.
People who have dyslexia are more likely to drop out of school, be unemployed, experience anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation.
So it's really good to have, I think families need to know that if you're supporting of your child, even when they have things you don't understand how to address, that's going to be very helpful for them in the long run. Yeah,
they need some, like all superheroes, right? They need some supporters and fans and those folks that are rooting for them.
So what would be your advice for someone who has dyslexia at any age, child or an adult? Or
depends who you're talking to there for kids. I've done this. I was a big brother, big sister way back when in Lincoln, Nebraska, years ago, and my little had dyslexia. So we talked at length.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Oh, well, it was great. And I was like, I think I can be helpful here, right? Because it was a very similar situation where his parents really didn't understand what that meant. Is that what's that? Is that a terminal diagnosis, or is it something that you can work through? So we spent a lot of time kind of unpacking his superpower and identifying strategies to help him be a more successful reader. And I just remember the look in his eyes more than anything. It's a look of relief. And I remember what that relief felt like, is knowing that this isn't a terminal disease. This is something that you can work through. And actually, in some ways, let's treat it as a superpower. And so for young people, I would talk about it that way, is figuring out strategy with, certainly, and you know this, that we have expertise.
Help is available, and people with dyslexia can learn to read.
I think about our reading center, right, at Pitt State. We have folks that come from all over the country. So there's expertise to be found all over the country that can really help families navigate how to support and root for their little superheroes. I think that if it's an adult situation, you can talk more logically about what this is and unpacking and explaining it and working through strategies to be more effective in reading and how that impacts the rest of their life.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because there are some parents who just didn't think they were very good at school and struggled to read and didn't really think much about it, just thought they weren't very good students. And then now they're having children who are having this very same problems because of that kind of genetic linkage. They're like, oh, this is not happening for my kid. We're going to figure this out.
Right.
And then when they're being told what's going on with the child, they're like, oh, check, that was me. Check, that was me. Check. Yep. Oh, I had dyslexia, or I have dyslexia.
Dyslexia has a genetic basis. Children with dyslexia are likely to have a family member who also has dyslexia.
And the viewer can't really see this, but there's books all over this room. And you would say that you probably, would you say you read for pleasure now? Or is it still a struggle, but it's still kind of a pleasure to be able to succeed?
Oh, total pleasure. It's the puzzle playing for me. So it is, and it depends on what your hobby is, or if you like to do crosswords or whatever the game of choice is that stimulates your mind. For me, and maybe it's just a coping mechanism for years of feeling like you're less than. I probably read more today. It's rare that I don't have 3 or 4 books going at the same time. Maybe there's something else at work there, but certainly I'm wanting to learn and understand and kind of play that puzzle game with each of those books all at the same time. And so I think that's it's liberated me long ago to want to learn and know more and not be afraid to read difficult, challenging books. I'll tell you what, if you give me a book with 600 pages with small font, that is a real challenge for me, because it seems like you think about those large puzzles you put together, that is a tough one for me, but that's more of a challenge. So I usually have one of those going at the same time.
Do you have any favorite books that you recommend to people?
A ton. Well, and what you don't see, if you did in here, it started for me literally superheroes with comic books. So we had a pretty competitive comic book family. So I had brothers that are 10 and 12 years older, and they had their comic book collections before I was around, and my father did, and I picked up right with them. But comic books and the way they were written really enabled me to track what I was reading and made it digestible. So I remember, what you don't see is a comic book collection in here. That's also, I remember those early days of building my confidence in being able to read through a story. And that led to smaller books and then on to larger books through the years. I would just say I have so many favorite books. The one that stands out for me is I just recently read The Second Mountain by David Brooks. And that, not that for the purposes of this, but I think it, in a way, talks about which mountain are you on. The first mountain, the metaphor is that we're all on from a career standpoint, wanting to have a nice car, a family, whatever the stereotype is that there is. At some point in our life, and it could be young, dyslexia could be part of it, knocks you off that mountain. And you find yourself trying to figure out what's next. And you see a second mountain, which is more about others, greater good, living a life that does more for others. And so whatever those moments are that kind of knock us off that first mountain, we begin to find ourselves in maybe a higher calling or meaning related to the work and life that you live at some point. So that would be a good one for anybody that's interested in probably a lot of the work that you do, and the folks that might see this. They're on that second mountain for sure.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
One last question.
Yeah.
What would you like to see educators do? And that's not just in, P-12 education, but even having access to higher education for kids who are struggling readers who have dyslexia.
I think it's liberating ourselves, right? A lot of times I talk about whether this can span a lot of different professions, but we get in these zombie states. Like, I know this pedagogy, I know this way to do things, and don't bring anything new into the equation. And it's liberating at some point, right, to begin to think differently about, are there different strategies, are there different ways we can approach students, whether they're dyslexic or not. How do we reach students today in a way that allows them to continue to learn and advance their journey, whatever that is? And I think, and I've taught for 25 years, it can get pretty comfortable to approach things, whether it's a methodology, a theory, you name it, that this is the only way to do it. And I know you know this from your work. There are many ways to approach reading and a lot of people feel they have it down, but what does the science say? What does the data say? I think we should always be in higher education advancing that and realizing that there's more that can be learned and done to really improve reading and results, especially if we're talking about dyslexia. We should be open to the science.
I agree.
Yeah,
yeah.
I know you do.
And I thank you for your time. Those are really great answers. I think that people are interested in your thoughts and thoughts of that nature, so they can not only help themselves as parents or as teachers, but particularly children who are struggling readers, and what they can do to support them psychologically, emotionally, in addition to academically. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.